Who is pound for pound the best MMA fighter in the world? GSP?
Fedor Emelianenko.
All right, very objective there.
Do you even think of a biggest MMA empire who never ever fight in the UFC, which is the biggest organization in MMA, period? Yes, he was Fedor Emelianenko, a heavyweight Russian fighter.
If you don't know, now you know. That's the GOAT, Fedor Emelianenko.
Do you know the views of Fedor about his selection in UFC? In this video, we will reveal all about the real story and truth of staying away from UFC. Without further delay, let's begin.
Fedor versus Mir has begun. Fight Clock brought to you by Miller Lite. Great taste and only 96 calories. Emelianenko and Mir both capable of sending the other to a quiet place.
Fedor Emelianenko, the greatest heavyweight MMA fighter, known as the Mike Tyson of MMA, with a weight of 110 kilograms. At the time, almost everybody regarded Fedor Emelianenko as the world's best heavyweight boxer. Hardly anybody would contest that he's at least among the top heavyweight mixed martial artists of all time. Many still see him as the greatest of all time. However, there is a disclaimer regarding Fedor's career, which ended at 34-4 with one no contest and a winning streak of 3 fights when he retired. He never participated in an MMA match in the UFC, which is currently regarded as the industry standard. But didn't it feel weird that he never got to be a part of UFC in his reign? Fedor wanted to be in the UFC, and the UFC wanted Fedor at one point. They seemed on the verge of finalizing an agreement to match Fedor with Brock Lesnar, the UFC heavyweight champion at the time. Why, therefore, did it never occur? What's the main logic behind this, according to Fedor himself as well as of the UFC? Because in his interview for The Voice vs. Fedor, an upcoming show on AXS TV, Fedor replied with a statement. "The UFC didn't want me to fight there. We couldn't agree. They made inadequate terms offer." Before Emelianenko defeated Tim Johnson via knockout at Bellator 269 in October 2021, Emelianenko made remarks about White.
Надо сначала научиться уважать людей, с которыми он собирается работать. Уважать бойцов.
Naturally, White gave a response when questioned about the remarks made after UFC 267 in that same month. White remarked, "To start with, I don't even know Fedor. Fedor is unfamiliar with me. We had a single meeting. I was all about money," he said, "and he ought to have been more concerned with money when we made you that offer, wherever the F we were on the island. And you wouldn't be fighting at 45 years old." For a brief while, the 47-fight veteran thought a deal could be reached, but the UFC wouldn't accept his demands. As a result, Emelianenko is arguably the best fighter in history to have never faced off in an octagon. "It was a possibility at one point when the UFC bought Pride," Emelianenko remarked. However, Dana White did not sign the agreement. For this reason, it didn't occur. Dana White, the Ultimate Fighting Championship president, claims that to meet with you and your team, he took a plane to a secret island.
I flew to some island out in the middle of nowhere, okay? Did everything that they asked to do.
So, what do you people think that has been done? Similarly, Fedor asked, "Is it true that the UFC really offered you $5 million guaranteed?" In response, Fedor said,
"Offered you $5 million guaranteed?"
"No, this is not true.
I describe everything precisely as it occurred. I wasn't invited to fight at the UFC."
I want it worse than the fans want it now, believe me.
I think they wanted you.
We went there for nothing because those guys literally went there to not make a deal.
Mixed martial arts organization in the world today. But people are curious as to why Fedor and his management rejected the promotion's invitation to compete in the octagon. However, as Fedor notes, things weren't always like that. There was a debate that Pride had the best fighters in the world, especially in the heavyweight division, when the Russian fighter was king of the mat in Japan.
Actually, when I fought in Pride, we had the best fighters in the world.
However, the greatest of the best weren't competing in the UFC in the early 2000s. The world's top fighters were among us. Dude, he was really good. He could knock you out or submit you, and he was so stoic and frightening. He was good, for heaven's sake. 9 of his 13 opponents in Pride were either current or past UFC fighters. These included former UFC champion Mark Coleman and Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, who both competed in the UFC before and after losing to Fedor. He lost against Fedor twice as well, When Fedor takes hold of a limb in any of his fights, he nearly always completes the task at hand. And when someone takes hold of his limb, he nearly always manages to get away. You're just amazed that Kevin Randleman, the former UFC champion, Mirko Cro Cop, an MMA legend, competed in the UFC following his defeat by Fedor in one of the greatest heavyweight bouts in history. By the way, Fedor weighed only 230 pounds and stood just 6 feet tall. That's little by heavyweight fighter standards. In Pride, another Russian fighter was causing chaos as well. The Grim Reaper was the name he was given. Alexander, Fedor's brother, was like him, but things would turn out very differently for him. The UFC was going through a major and severe crisis at the time. They were having some difficulties obtaining elite fighters. Pride has all the top fighters. The UFC didn't pick up steam right away after Pride's downfall in 2007. But if you think Fedor is attempting to minimize the UFC in his interview and is simply expressing his frustrations, that's not the case. As Fedor freely acknowledges that the UFC is currently leading the world, even though the UFC and Pride were competing for talent before Zuffa purchased the Japanese organization. At the moment, the UFC is arguably the greatest organization in the world. Even though Fedor doesn't consider himself a fight fanatic, he does acknowledge that there are many excellent fighters in every weight class. Dana White was never able to sign Fedor, but that didn't stop him from creating the biggest MMA empire in the world. In front of the last mixed martial arts match of his illustrious career, Fedor Emelianenko says he has no regrets about staying out of the UFC octagon. In his farewell fight, Emelianenko will face Ryan Bader for the Bellator Heavyweight Championship on Saturday at Bellator 290 at the Kia Forum in Inglewood, California. The promotion will debut for the first time on CBS Network television during the event. Although there had been discussions behind closed doors between Emelianenko and the UFC for a number of years, no agreement was reached to include the last emperor in the promotion. From Emelianenko's perspective, his career path ultimately unfolded as it was meant to. In front of the last mixed martial arts match of his illustrious career, Fedor Emelianenko says he has no regrets about staying out of the UFC octagon.
You had Fedor retiring tonight. Any thoughts on another legend hanging him up and done for good with the sport?
Listen, there's a guy like 46. Yeah, he shouldn't be fighting.
So, although it is a notary topic to discuss, but not anyone can deny Fedor as one of the best heavyweight fighters, even though he stayed away from the UFC. What are your comments on the absence of Fedor in UFC? Whose viewpoints matter the most on entry of him in UFC? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Stay tuned for the next video. Until next time.